Beneath the ancient oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, there is a row of 9 graves that Charleston's old families learned to step around without looking too closely. The stones are modest but dignified, each one bearing the name of a prosperous plantation owner who died between 1851 and 1855. The causes of death, according to the physicians who signed the certificates, were all variations of the same phrase: sudden paralysis, followed by what they called a merciful end. For nearly 70 years, that was the story men of standing taken swiftly by the mysterious ailments that sometimes stalked the low-country heat. But in 1923, when the cemetery was partially excavated for renovation, the groundskeepers opened those 9 coffins and found something that did not match the gentle language of the death records. The inside of each wooden lid was scored with frantic, splintered gouges, the marks of human fingernails raked again and again into the wood. The bodies were twisted in impossible angles, muscles locked in the last convulsions of terror. These men had not died peacefully at all. They had died fighting for breath in the dark city. Officials were summoned. The coffins were closed. The reports were quietly sealed. But the horror did not end there. Because beneath the oldest magnolia tree in St. Michael's, wrapped in decaying oilcloth and buried in a shallow, unmarked hollow, workers uncovered a leather-bound journal. Its pages, written in a careful, educated hand, bore the name of a man Charleston's records barely mentioned, Solomon Fairfax. Over nearly 4 years of entries, that journal described in cold and methodical detail a revenge that began with the sound of a family screaming and ended with 9 men lowered into the earth while still alive. Before we follow the path that turned a gentle healer into Charleston's most deliberate killer, take a moment to stay with us in these shadows. Join this small community of people willing to look at the parts of history others tried to bury. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and when you're ready to come back to the light, tell us where you're listening from. The past we're about to walk through belongs to all of us. The journal's first entry is dated March 15th, 1851. Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. To understand what he meant, we have to go back 2 years before the first coffin was nailed shut. Back to Charleston in the 1850s, when the city gleamed like a crown set along the Cooper and Ashley Rivers, white-columned mansions faced the water, their galleries draped with gaslight and jasmine. Rice and cotton wealth flowed through drawing rooms where families spoke of Europe, classical music, and Christian charity, while a different kind of economy groaned beneath their feet. The city's medical men, though few in number, enjoyed enormous authority among these elites. The planters and merchants trusted their private physicians with every fainting spell, every mysterious fever, every creeping weakness. In those years, the upper circles of Charleston society seemed to suffer from an epidemic of strange ailments, periodic fevers, sudden collapses, and paralytic events that doctors struggled to explain, but always found a way to name. In 1845, a physician named Dr. Cornelius Hathaway opened a small practice on Meeting Street. Within a few years, he had become a favorite of the city's wealthiest families, celebrated for his willingness to experiment with new treatments and exotic remedies arriving from distant colonies. His success, however, did not belong to him alone. It depended on the quiet brilliance of a man who, in the eyes of the law, was his property. Solomon Fairfax had been purchased expressly for Hathaway's practice, a slave with an almost uncanny understanding of medicinal plants and chemical preparations. His skill had been forged over generations, passed down through relatives who had served as healers on plantations scattered across the Carolina Lowcountry. Where others saw swamps and thickets, Solomon saw a pharmacy. He was not the bent, broken figure most white Charlestonians expected when they heard the word slave. He stood tall, with a stillness that made people lower their voices around him. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging every gesture, every symptom, every reaction. On his previous plantation, he had been allowed, briefly, to study alongside the master's children. He had learned to read, to write, even to puzzle through Latin medical terms from discarded textbooks. It was a dangerous education, one that would later terrify the South. When Solomon first arrived at Hathaway's practice, the doctor was taken aback by his assistant's precision, the way he handled glassware, measured powders, and recalled dosages. Soon, the physician found himself relying on the slave's steady hands and formidable memory. Solomon prepared tinctures and poultices, assisted with minor surgeries, and stood beside the examination table as Charleston's wealthiest men and women entrusted their fragile bodies to him without ever acknowledging him as anything more than the doctor's boy. Some of them even asked for him by name. Drawn to his quiet voice and unerring attentiveness, they never wondered what was happening behind those observant eyes. For most of his life, though, Solomon had not lived among shelves of glass and brass. For 32 years, before he was led to the Charleston slave market and sold, he had belonged to the Pemberton plantation, 15 miles beyond the city there, in a narrow cabin behind the big house. He had built the only world that mattered to him. Her name was Celia. They had been married 15 years. Together they had 3 children. Marcus, 8, sharp-eyed and restless. Samuel, 6, gentle and quick with his hands. And Grace, a little girl of 4 who clung to her father's leg and slept holding her mother's hair between her fingers. The Pembertons allowed this family to remain together for a reason that had nothing to do with kindness. Solomon's healing skills were too valuable to risk losing. When fever swept through the slave quarters, when infection set into a cut, when a child began to cough and would not stop, it was Solomon who moved from pallet to pallet. With his bundles of leaves and bottles of bitter medicine, he treated slaves, and increasingly, the white family in the big house, his remedies saving lives that made money for other men. In a world built on suffering, he became a rare, quiet force pushing back against death. That fragile arrangement shattered in March of 1851. Edmund Pemberton, poisoned by his own appetites, cards, racing, speculative ventures gone wrong, found himself drowning in debt to stave off financial ruin. He did what planters so often did. He began turning people into numbers. Lot 7, female, prime age, skilled in the kitchen. Lot 8, boy, 8, strong for his years. Lot 9, boy, 6, sound, good teeth. Lot 10, girl, 4, house training begun, Solomon's wife and children. The plan was simple, brutal, and common. The family would be broken apart, sold to different buyers, scattered like seeds across the state. Pemberton told himself it was business. He told others the same. Men who prided themselves on honor nodded in understanding. Solomon went to him as a healer goes to a patient, offering everything he had. Years of work without pay, extra labor on neighboring plantations, any arrangement that would keep Celia and the children on the same soil. Pemberton listened, restless and impatient, and refused. His creditors wanted coin, not promises. The auction was set for March 14th in Charleston. Nothing, he said, could change that. The morning of the sale dawned heavy and airless, with storm clouds pressing low over the Ashley River. In the small cabin, the air was thicker still. Solomon held his family as if memorizing them by touch. The curve of Celia's jaw, The way Marcus furrowed his brow when he was afraid, but refused to cry, Samuel's hand creeping toward his father's, seeking reassurance he did not dare ask for out loud. Grace's soft, confused questions. Celia did not weep in front of the children. She braided Grace's hair and straightened the boys' shirts with a trembling efficiency, teaching them how to face the worst thing that could happen with their backs unbent. When the traders arrived, the family stepped into the yard together. Chains, ledgers, shouted orders. They were loaded onto a wagon with other families from neighboring fields, each group held together for a few final hours by iron rather than love. As the wheels creaked into motion, the air filled with the sound of prayers and promises, vows to find each other again, someday, somehow. Everyone knew most of those vows were lies spoken to keep the heart from breaking in front of the children. Halfway to the city, one of the wagon wheels plunged into a rut carved deep by the recent rains. The wagon lurched violently. Celia, standing near the edge, lost her footing and fell. Her head struck a rock with a crack that silenced the nearest voices. Blood spread quickly in the mud. Solomon hurled himself toward her, but shackled hands and bodies pressed close held him back. He begged the traders to stop, to fetch a doctor, to do anything but leave her there. One of them knelt, pressed rough fingers to Celia's neck, and glanced at the blood already drying on her hair. His calculation was quick and cold. "She's lost," he said. "Cargo's no good. We've got a schedule." They ordered the driver to move on. The wagon jolted forward. Solomon's scream followed them down the road until even that sound was swallowed by the city's distant noise. The people around him turned their faces away. They could not afford to look too long at what might happen to them tomorrow. In Charleston's slave market, under the gaze of men in fine coats and ladies watching from shaded balconies, the rest of Solomon's world was taken from him piece by piece. Marcus went first, sold to a rice planter from Georgetown, who favored boys for the lethal work of managing flooded fields. Samuel went to a notoriously harsh cotton planter in the upcountry, a man whose name was spoken in whispers among slave quarters. Grace, too small to work the fields, was purchased as a house servant by a family in Savannah, vanishing into a maze of parlors and backstairs from which no news would ever return. Solomon watched it all with a face carved from stone. No tears. No pleading once the bidding began. He understood that any public resistance would bring punishment and change nothing. So he swallowed every scream and let it sit inside him like a swallowed coal. Later that day, Dr. Cornelius Hathaway bought him. The doctor saw only a skilled healer on the block, a man with a reputation for saving lives. He paid more than most would have, confident that this investment would quickly repay itself in the coins of grateful planters and anxious wives. He knew nothing of Celia bleeding by the roadside, nothing of 3 children being led away in 3 different directions. That evening, in the cramped room above Hathaway's practice that would now serve as his quarters, Solomon lit a candle and pulled out a small leather journal he had kept hidden for years, a forbidden relic of his brief education. With hands that had spent the day in chains, he dipped a pen into ink and began to write today. I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I am still alive. I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They believed they have broken me. They have only taught me patience. The months that followed blurred into routine for everyone but Solomon, days of boiling instruments, measuring powders, and holding patients' hands as needles slid beneath their skin. Charleston's aristocracy came and went. describing their pains in languid voices, never imagining that the slave in the corner was studying them. Names, houses, business entanglements, connections to the market where children were sold like calves. Dr. Hathaway grew older and more dependent, his arthritic hands stiffening until he began to lean on Solomon, not just for assistance, but for judgment. On busy days, the doctor sent him to see patients alone. The rich grew used to explaining their symptoms to a man they refused to call free. And all the while, Solomon listened. He listened to the way they spoke of auctions, of debts, of human property, moved from one ledger to another. He pieced together who had stood beneath the awning on the day his family was sold, who had laughed, who had bargained, who had lent the money that made the whole transaction possible. There were more of them than he had realized. Pemberton, he discovered, had only been one weak link in a much stronger chain. In Hathaway's library, among the Latin texts and leather-bound treatises, Solomon found something else. Knowledge his previous masters had never meant for him to have. Books on pharmaceutical compounds, accounts of exotic poisons from South America, Africa, and Asia, clinical descriptions of substances that could still the muscles while leaving the mind awake. One passage, in a volume on South American plant toxins, fixed itself in his mind, a vine-derived compound that produced total paralysis while preserving consciousness, giving the appearance of peaceful death to any observer who did not know precisely what to look for. A way to make a man lie silent and helpless while others pronounced him dead. A way to let him feel the lid close. Through a professor friend of Hathaway's, a botanist who prized rare specimens, Solomon found living samples of the vine carefully tended in a Charleston greenhouse. The professor, delighted by the slave's apparent enthusiasm for plants, welcomed his help. At night, by lamplight in a small outbuilding behind the practice, Solomon began to test the plant's properties on mice. He recorded dosages, reactions, the exact interval between first weakness and complete stillness. Too little, and the animal merely staggered, then recovered too much, and death came too swiftly. But at a precise measure, after a precise number of minutes, the small chest stopped rising while the eyes remained bright and frantic. He had at last the instrument he needed. The first name in his journal, under the heading Men Who Laughed, was Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a rice planter who had joked loudly about the breeding stock on offer the day Solomon's sons were sold. Fitzpatrick suffered from gout and a failing heart, and visited Hathaway's office each month for relief. He came alone, without family, without witnesses. In December of 1852, the colonel arrived complaining that his pain was worse than ever. Dr. Hathaway, busy with another patient, waved Solomon toward the treatment room. "Begin the usual preparations," he said. "I'll join you shortly." Solomon mixed the familiar draft, then, with the same steady hands that had saved so many lives, added a few clear drops of his own making. Fitzpatrick swallowed it without hesitation. Within minutes, a faint weakness crept into the colonel's limbs. He shifted uneasily in the chair, frowning. Solomon stepped closer, his voice soft and even. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," he said, "my name is Solomon Fairfax. You destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14th, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. Do you remember?" The colonel's eyes widened. His mouth opened, but the muscles would no longer obey him. Breath became shallow. Fingers twitched, then stilled. "You are not dying yet," Solomon continued quietly. "Not in the way you think. The medicine I gave you has taken your body, but not your mind. You can hear me. You can feel everything. In a short while, Dr. Hathaway will come in, examine you, and say that your heart has failed. They will carry you home. Tomorrow, they will place you in your coffin. They will lower you into St. Michael's. He leaned close enough that the colonel could see every line in his face. But you will still be here, Solomon whispered. You will hear the dirt strike the lid. You will feel the weight above you. You will know what it is to be helpless. When Dr. Hathaway entered the room a few minutes later, he found his assistant standing silently beside what appeared to be a dead man. Solomon described a sudden collapse, a quiet passing. The doctor, noting Fitzpatrick's long-standing heart trouble, sighed and confirmed the obvious within hours. The colonel's body was laid out in his mansion. The next day, under Charleston's washed-out winter sky, his coffin was lowered into the earth at St. Michael's. Among the slaves clustered at the edge of the crowd stood Solomon, his face expressionless as the first shovelfuls of dirt thudded onto the wood. That night in his journal, he wrote, "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." The months that followed Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial moved slowly on the surface, like the tide sliding in and out along the harbor. But beneath that calm, something churned. Charleston whispered about the colonel's death, of course. There were condolences offered over silver tea sets, quiet remarks about how quickly the heart could fail a man, and sermons about the uncertainty of earthly life. But no one questioned the diagnosis. A man with bad gout and a weak heart dies suddenly. There was nothing in that to trouble the city's sleep. No one, except the man who had watched the coffin disappear into the ground, knowing that the body inside had not been dead when the lid was nailed shut. For Solomon, the success of his first act of vengeance brought no comfort. He slept poorly, waking in the darkness with his own limbs numb, his chest tight, as if he too were trapped beneath earth. He imagined, against his will, what Fitzpatrick's last hours had been. The stale air, the weight above, the desperate scratching that never broke the wood. It was not guilt that haunted him, but the sheer intimacy of the terror he had induced. Still, no suspicion touched him. In Hathaway's practice, life returned to its practiced rhythm. Patients came and went. Bills were settled, bottles were restocked. The only change was inside Solomon, where a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. With one name struck from his list, he turned to the second. Judge Marcus Calverton was not a man of the fields, but of the courtroom. He was the kind of man who lent slavery its legal polish. He had written opinions justifying the sale of children, apart from their parents, as a necessary measure for discipline and economic stability. It was his language that transformed the destruction of families into legal doctrine. By the time Solomon began to focus on him, Calverton suffered from vicious migraines. The pain drove him regularly to Hathaway's office, where he sat in the dim examination room, one hand pressed to his temple, asking for anything that might ease the pounding behind his eyes. He was older than Fitzpatrick, his veins already weakened by age and stress. Among physicians, it was well known that men in his condition sometimes died suddenly of strokes. Solomon could not have asked for a better cover. But before he could act, an unexpected threat appeared inside the one place he thought he controlled. In March of 1853, Dr. Hathaway announced, with a mixture of relief and pride, that he was considering taking on a junior partner. The man was young, Dr. Timothy Henderson, recently returned from training in Philadelphia. He was eager, bright, and worst of all, up to date on the latest medical thinking from northern schools. For Charleston, Henderson represented modern science. For Solomon, he represented scrutiny. Another pair of eyes in the practice meant fewer moments alone with patients, fewer unobserved preparations in the dispensary, more careful records of every dose administered. Worse, Henderson's training had exposed him to new ideas about how to detect unusual substances in the bodies of the dead. Forensic medicine, still crude, was beginning to learn the language of invisible poisons. Solomon understood at once what this meant. The leisurely campaign he had imagined, years of carefully spaced deaths, each wrapped in plausible illness, was no longer possible if he hesitated. His opportunities would vanish into the keen gaze of the young doctor, who did not yet know how the South preferred its mysteries handled. He would have to move faster, much faster. That urgency led to his first real misstep. When Judge Calverton came in one April afternoon complaining of an especially brutal headache, the office was busy. Henderson was visiting another patient. Hathaway was occupied with a complicated case. Once again, Solomon found himself alone with a prominent man whose body he knew almost as well as his own. He prepared the judge's usual draft, a mixture meant to dull pain and induce rest. His hands moved quickly, too quickly. In his concentration, he added a trace more of the paralytic compound than he had planned. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to alter the way the toxin settled into the judge's muscles. Calverton swallowed the medicine. Within minutes, his speech slurred. One side of his face sagged. A moment later, his limbs stiffened with a speed and severity that even Solomon had not anticipated. By the time Hathaway entered, the judge was already locked in the toxin's grip, eyes wide with a terror that his body could not express. "Strange," the doctor murmured, bending over the corpse-like figure. "The rigidity. It's more pronounced than I would expect from a simple apoplexy, and look at his eyes." He peered closer, frowning. "There's something desperate in them." For a few long seconds, the room held its breath. Solomon stood still, every sense tuned to the slightest hint that Hathaway might see through the illusion. If the doctor decided to delay the pronouncement of death, if he chose to test reflexes or wait for changes, the fragile structure of Solomon's justice would collapse. But the moment passed. Hathaway straightened, chalking the peculiarities up to the severity of the stroke. "Poor man," he said, shaking his head. "He must have suffered terribly in the end." He had no idea how accurate that was. Judge Calverton was buried in St. Michael's, 3 rows away from Colonel Fitzpatrick. Once again, Solomon stood at the back, within the narrow strip of ground allotted to enslaved mourners, watching as ropes lowered another man who had once spoken casually of the legality of tearing children from their mothers. Yet this time, he was not the only one watching closely. At the edge of the gathering, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers and an inquisitive gaze stood apart from the crowd, scribbling diligently into a small leather notebook. His name was Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury. For several months, he had been tracking what he called, in private, the prominent deaths, a small but growing cluster of sudden fatalities among men of wealth and influence individually. Each death made sense. Together, they formed a pattern that smelled wrong to a man whose trade was suspicion. That night, Solomon wrote in his own journal again, "Judge Calverton has joined Fitzpatrick beneath the earth. But the city's curiosity stirs. There is a watcher among them now. I must move quickly, or not at all. His next target would have to fall soon." The third man on Solomon's list was Captain William Dandridge, owner of several ships that sailed out of Charleston. Loaded with shackled human beings, Dandridge had built a fortune transporting slaves between markets, treating their bodies as cargo to be stacked and delivered with minimal loss. He had personally supervised the loading of men, women, and children into his holds, adjusting chains and space allowances with the same grim efficiency he applied to bales of cotton. Unlike Fitzpatrick and Calverton, Dandridge was not a regular patient. He came to the practice only for minor injuries, a sprained wrist from the docks, a cut from an errant rope. His health, overall, was solid. There would be no natural sickness to hide behind. Solomon would have to make his own occasion. Through whispered conversations in kitchens and cramped slave quarters, he learned of one Martha, an older woman who oversaw cooking for many of Charleston's grand houses, mentioned that Captain Dandridge planned a dinner at his mansion on East Bay Street on May 20th. A gathering of shipping magnates to celebrate the expansion of certain profitable routes. Solomon offered his help. Martha, who trusted his quiet competence and knew nothing of his plans, gladly accepted an extra pair of hands. Several of her usual assistants were down with fever. She needed someone who could move between kitchen and dining room without drawing attention. That night, Dandridge's dining room glowed with gaslight. Crystal decanters of wine and brandy caught the flicker of flames. The men around the table laughed loudly, their conversation drifting easily between weather, tariffs, and the logistics of transporting hundreds of chained souls across water. Solomon moved among them like a shadow, refilling glasses, clearing plates, invisible the way only a slave could be in a room full of powerful men. He listened as Dandridge described methods for suppressing uprisings in the hold, for keeping stock alive just long enough to be profitable at the other end. Every word only sharpened Solomon's resolve. The opportunity came with dessert. The final course was a rich, brandy-soaked cake served individually to each guest. In the sweltering chaos of the kitchen, amid clattering plates and shouted instructions, Solomon drew aside the portion destined for the captain. With careful hands, he dripped his compound into the alcohol-heavy sponge, where it disappeared without a trace. Dandridge devoured it with enthusiasm, praising Martha's skill and asking if she could prepare it aboard one of his ships someday. He laughed at his own joke, lifted his glass again, and continued boasting. Half an hour later, as the discussion grew louder and the room hotter, he pressed a hand to his chest and frowned. "Too much wine," he muttered, pushing back his chair. "I need air." He rose and walked, a little unsteady, to his private study. He did not return. When a servant finally went to check on him, the captain was slumped in his chair, eyes open and unblinking, limbs rigid. The alarm spread quickly. Guests crowded the doorway. Someone shouted for a doctor. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the merchant's personal physicians and a guest at the dinner, knelt beside the body, examining it carefully. The room was silent except for his low mutterings. "This is unusual," he said at last. "He appears to have suffered some kind of seizure, but there are none of the usual signs of apoplexy. The muscles—" He touched the captain's arm, then jaw. "There is an extraordinary rigidity. It is almost as if—" He hesitated, then spoke the word everyone in the room had been dreading, "as if he has been poisoned." The effect was immediate. Men who had spent their lives profiting from human suffering blanched at the thought that someone had turned invisible violence on one of their own before dawn. More physicians had been called, each offering variations on the same uneasy conclusion. Gossip raced down East Bay Street, and curled through Charleston's drawing rooms like smoke. Among the first to arrive at the mansion that morning, notebook in hand, was Thomas Grimby. He spoke to servants, to Martha, to the men who had attended the dinner. He learned that a familiar figure had been moving quietly through the room, Dr. Hathaway's slave assistant, Solomon. The same man who had been present when Fitzpatrick died. The same man who had stood, calm and steady, near Judge Calverton's body. Patterns began to harden into something heavier. Solomon could feel the circle tightening. 3 men were down. 6 remained. And now, whispers of poison danced on every street corner, while a young journalist connected graves and names on paper like lines in a web he understood. The old method would no longer suffice. If he continued killing them one by one, suspicion would eventually catch up to him before his list was complete. The system that had destroyed his family would survive with most of its architects still intact. So he conceived a plan that was as desperate as it was devastating. He would take as many of them as he could at once. His investigations had uncovered a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1853, at the offices of Henderson and Associates, a firm deeply entangled in financing slave shipments. 6 of Charleston's most prominent traders and investors in human flesh would gather there after hours to discuss a major expansion of their business. The building was lit by gas. A central line fed lamps throughout the offices. Over the course of 2 weeks, working alone at night in a shed behind Hathaway's practice, Solomon prepared a concentrated form of his paralytic compound. He siphoned small quantities of chemicals from the medical stores, mixing and distilling until the toxin, once a mere drop in a draft, could saturate air itself. On the evening of June 15th, he waited in the narrow alley behind the Henderson and Associates building, listening as carriage wheels rattled away and footsteps ascended the stairs. At 8 o'clock precisely, the windows above him bloomed with the yellow glow of gaslight. Moments later, in the dark of the basement where the main gas line could be accessed, Solomon worked quickly and without hesitation. He opened the pipe just enough to introduce his toxin, then sealed it again, knowing that the flames in the lamps above would now carry death into the lungs of everyone breathing that air. He returned to the alley and waited. Within half an hour, the muffled sounds of conversation faded. No footsteps, no voices, no scraping chairs. The silence inside the building was as complete as the silence of a closed coffin. An hour later, using a duplicate key acquired through weeks of careful observation and quiet theft, Solomon slipped inside through the back door and climbed the stairs to the main conference room. What he found there was like a macabre tableau. 6 men sat around a polished mahogany table, each frozen in the position he had occupied when the toxin reached its peak, one with his hand halfway to his glass, another leaning forward, lips parted, another with a pen still resting in stiff fingers above a contract. Their chests did not rise. Their lips did not move. But their eyes, only their eyes, shifted in panic as Solomon stepped into view. He moved slowly around the room, leaning close to each face, speaking in that same measured, almost gentle tone he had used beside the examination table. He told them his name. He told them what they had done. He told them exactly what they were about to endure. "You will be pronounced dead," he whispered. "You will be dressed in your finest clothes. Your families will weep over you. They will place you in boxes and send you into the earth, and you will feel every second of it, unable to move, unable to speak, knowing only that you are alive inside a body everyone believes to be a corpse." For a brief, flickering moment, Solomon felt something close to satisfaction. Years of grief, humiliation, and quiet observation had flowered into this room filled with breathing statues. Then he heard footsteps in the corridor. He stepped back from the table as the latch turned. The door opened, and Thomas Grimby stood there, framed in the lamplight, his notebook in one hand. His face gone pale at the sight of 6 motionless men and a solitary slave standing among them. "So," Grimby said softly, his voice unsteady but clear. "It's true. Someone has been killing Charleston's great men, and it's you." He looked from Solomon to the victim's eyes and saw what the physicians had missed. The flicker of awareness trapped behind paralysis. "They're not dead," he whispered. "Not yet." Solomon met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said. "Not yet." He did not deny what he had done. He did not beg or threaten. When Grimby demanded to know why, Solomon answered with the same stark clarity he had used in his journal. "They sold my children as if they were calves," he said. "They left my wife bleeding on the roadside like an animal that had fallen from a cart. The law called that proper. The church blessed those men, where in all of this was justice. I made my own." The journalist hesitated, caught between the story he had been chasing and the human truth standing in front of him. He understood what slavery did to people. Everyone in Charleston did, whether they admitted it or not. But now he faced the cost of looking at it too closely. "You can't be allowed to go on," Grimby said at last, "but I can't pretend not to see why you began." Outside, more footsteps echoed up the stairs. Heavier, more numerous voices, loud and officious, drifted down the hall. Someone else had arrived at the building. Soon, the room would be full. "There's a back stair," Grimby muttered quickly. "You could still leave. I could delay what I write for a few hours." Solomon listened, then slowly shook his head. "I have finished what I can," he said. 9 men destroyed my family. Tonight I have reached 6. That will have to be enough. Let them come. Let them see what one slave did with the knowledge they gave him." The door burst open again. City constables spilled into the room, their lanterns flaring over the frozen faces at the table. For a heartbeat, no one spoke, stunned into silence by the impossible scene. Then every eye turned to the only living, moving man in the room. Solomon did not run. He raised his hands calmly as they advanced, the irons clinking as they closed around his wrists. When they demanded an explanation, he gave them one. Simple, detailed, precise. He described the plant, the experiments, the dosages. He listed the names of the dead and those sitting, still alive, but trapped in their bodies, around the table. By the time they led him out into the night, the quiet man from the back of the examination room had vanished. In his place, Charleston saw something it was not prepared to face, an enslaved healer who had turned the science meant to serve the powerful into a weapon against them. And the city understood, dimly and too late, that its dead were not resting nearly as peacefully as it had believed. The arrest of Solomon Fairfax sent a tremor through Charleston that no earthquake could have matched. In the span of a single night, the city's most rigid hierarchies had been inverted. A slave, quiet, literate, trusted, had outwitted the very men who believed themselves the keepers of order. And now he was in chains, walking through torchlit streets, with his head held steady as the constables hurried him toward the jail. By dawn, word had spread faster than any official report. Someone in the crowd claimed he saw Solomon smiling. Another swore he walked like a priest processing to the altar. Everyone agreed that he did not look afraid. He had no reason to be. Fear belonged to the living men he had left behind. 6 of Charleston's wealthiest citizens, discovered seated upright around a conference table, stiff as wood, breath shallow as a whisper. Physicians had worked through the night to revive them, and one by one, the toxin's paralysis ebbed. What followed, their testimonies about the terror of being trapped inside their own bodies, would ripple across the South for decades. But before any of that reached the public, Charleston had a trial to prepare. Solomon's confession, taken in a cramped room lit by a single oil lamp, was not a rambling outpouring, but a meticulous account. He explained the properties of the plant toxin, the extraction process, the precisions of dosage. He described each victim's involvement in the slave trade, down to the day and hour they had stood at the auction block where his family had been sold apart. The constables wrote until their fingers cramped. There was no mystery left to solve. Still, the trial of Solomon Fairfax became one of the most contentious proceedings in Charleston's antebellum history. Not because anyone doubted what he had done, the evidence was overwhelming, but because of what his actions implied. They suggested something the city had never wanted to face: that the people they held in bondage did not always remain silent, that knowledge could become a weapon, that a healer could become a force of righteous destruction. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Rutledge, kept its narrative simple. A slave had murdered 9 respectable men. He must be executed. To question anything deeper, they argued, was to risk undermining the foundations of society. The defense, appointed by the court and headed by attorney Benjamin Crawford, stood in a position no man envied. Crawford did not try to claim innocence. How could he? Instead, he attempted something more dangerous. He tried to explain. He stood before a courtroom thick with tension and began describing the slave auction of March 14, 1851, the wagon, the fall, Celia bleeding in the road, 3 children sold to 3 different plantations. He spoke of Solomon's forced separation from everyone he loved, a cruelty permitted, endorsed by law. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably. Others glared. A few left the room rather than listen. But the story had already taken hold. Witnesses came forward. Former slaves from the Pemberton plantation described Solomon's years as a healer, the small miracles he performed with poultices and herbs. Others told of the night Celia fell from the wagon and how the traders chose to leave her behind like ruined cargo. Then came the survivors. The 6 men from the Henderson and Associates meeting sat before the court, pale and trembling, describing the unbearable experience of lying motionless while their own death was pronounced. Colonel Harrison Vance, his voice cracking, told the courtroom, "I heard my wife scream my name. I heard her collapse over my body, and I lay there like stone, unable to move a finger to tell her I lived. I was dead to the world, trapped inside myself. If that was his revenge, then he succeeded." His words roiled the room like a hot wind. Physicians testified next. Dr. Hathaway, devastated and bewildered, explained how Solomon had been the most gifted assistant he had ever trained. He described the trust he had placed in him, the skill in his hands, the care he showed for suffering patients. He was a healer, Hathaway said softly. "I do not understand how this happened." But in the hallways, Charlestonians were beginning to understand all too clearly: if the gentle ones could break, then none of them were safe from what they themselves had built. As the trial stretched on, the Charleston Mercury published daily updates written by none other than Thomas Grimby. In clear, unflinching prose, he laid out the chain of events Solomon had described. He quoted the journal, Leaving out names but not meaning, the articles spread across the South, carried by steamship and rail, reprinted in New Orleans, Mobile, Richmond, and Savannah. News of the paralytic plant toxin ignited fear in slaveholding communities. Slave owners began watching their household servants more closely. Laws were proposed restricting the education of slaves even further. Some families locked away medical texts that enslaved assistants had once been permitted to read. A new understanding took shape, one that had always been true but seldom acknowledged. Knowledge in the hands of the oppressed was something the powerful feared most. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings moved toward their inevitable close. Solomon sat with hands folded, listening quietly as witness after witness tried to make sense of what he had done. When asked if he wished to speak, he rose slowly. Every eye followed him. Even the murmurs of the crowd ceased. His voice, when he began, was calm. "I was trained to preserve life," he said, "to ease suffering, to mend broken bodies." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "But I lived in a world that saw my family as nothing more than property. My wife was left to die in the mud. My children were scattered to the winds. And all of it was called lawful, proper, Christian." Several jurors lowered their eyes. Solomon continued, "I did not create this system. I merely learned how to speak its language. The same knowledge that healed their sons and wives also taught me how to unmake the men who profited from my suffering. I do not ask for mercy. No mercy was given to my family. I ask only that you remember why this happened." Silence pressed against the walls. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by hanging. No one was surprised, not even Solomon. The machinery of Charleston's justice system had never been designed for him. He spent his final weeks in a stone cell lit by a single high window. Grimby visited him twice, not as a journalist seeking a story, but as a man trying to reconcile what he had witnessed. He recorded Solomon's final reflections, calm, steady, absent of hatred. Only certainty remained. On the morning of October 15th, 1853, Solomon was led from his cell to the gallows built on the city's outskirts. More than 2,000 people gathered to watch. Some came from curiosity, others came from fear, a few came from something darker. As the noose settled around his neck, he looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces that had once passed him on the streets without truly seeing him. His final words were spoken clearly, carried on a cold autumn wind. "I die knowing that 9 men felt the terror my children felt when they were torn from everything they loved, that knowledge is enough. But remember this, the system that created such despair still lives, and others will suffer as we did. Even the most patient man has his limits." The trapdoor opened. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, far outside consecrated ground. But his story was not buried with him. The journal he wrote, every page of it filled with precise handwriting, was held as evidence. And though officials insisted it be sealed after the trial, it never returned to the court archive. Thomas Grimby kept copies, secretly, carefully. When he was an old man, trembling, nearly blind, he made one final choice. He buried Solomon's journal beneath the magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, beside the 9 men who had died clawing at their coffins. "I could not destroy it," Grimby wrote in his memoir, "but I could not let it be used to inspire more blood. Let the earth keep it until the world is ready." In 1923, when cemetery workers unearthed that same journal, along with the coffins bearing their terrible evidence, Charleston officials moved swiftly to hide what they had found. The records were sealed, the coffins reburied, the story whispered into silence. But the earth remembers. Wood remembers, paper remembers. The marks inside those 9 coffins were not myths. They were truths, scratched into splintered wood by men who died trying to rise again. The legacy of Solomon Fairfax spread far beyond Charleston. Slave owners across the South tightened restrictions on education. Doctors debated new methods to detect toxins. Ministers preached sermons about obedience and the dangers of unnatural knowledge. But in quieter corners of the country, something else stirred. An uncomfortable recognition that even the most oppressed among them carried a reservoir of grief that could one day overflow, and history would record that sometimes justice does not arrive as a verdict or a proclamation. Sometimes it moves quietly, wearing the hands of a healer and the patience of a grieving father. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it buries. And sometimes, when the world is not looking, it rises. What do you make of Solomon's story? Was he shaped by evil, or by the unbearable weight of a world built to break him? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more stories like this, stories buried beneath centuries of silence, subscribe, share, and stay with us in the dark places where the past still breathes.